They banned friction. They banned resistance. They banned the very force that built every engine, every weapon, every civilization worth fearing. The galactic hegemony called it progress. Humanity called it an opportunity. And deep beneath the rubble of a forgotten industrial city, one American engineer just found the blueprint that would bring a trillion-credit empire grinding, literally grinding, to its knees. Hit like, subscribe to HFY Endurance Tales, and drop a comment telling us if you saw this coming, because this story, it's about to change everything you thought you knew about the most powerful force in the universe. Let's roll. The year was 2847, and the universe had gone completely, terrifyingly silent. Not silent in the way a library is silent, or the way a sleeping house holds its breath at 3 in the morning. Silent in the way a machine is silent when every moving part has been stripped of the one thing that made it real: contact, resistance, friction. 7 years earlier, the galactic hegemony had passed the mandate of smooth continuance. In official translation, it sounded almost poetic. In practice, it was the single most arrogant piece of legislation ever etched into galactic law. The mandate declared kinetic friction a primitive mechanical inefficiency and outlawed its use across all hegemony-controlled systems, which, at that point, was roughly 83% of the known galaxy. Subquantum levitation replaced everything. Bearings, gears, axles, pistons gone. Every rotating component in every machine across the hegemony now floated on invisible magnetic cushions generated by quantum resonance fields. Ships moved in absolute silence. Factories hummed without vibration. Alien engineers celebrated. They threw galas. They gave speeches about transcending the crude mechanical age. The Velthara, the tall, silver-skinned species that dominated the hegemony's upper council, declared it the dawn of the frictionless epoch. Humanity was not invited to the celebration. Earth and its colonies had been under hegemony administrative oversight for 31 years, which was a polite way of saying occupied. Humans were tolerated as a labor class, occasionally praised for their stubbornness and creativity, but never truly trusted with the levers of power. When the mandate was passed, human engineers were ordered to retrofit all human-operated machinery to comply. Resistance was met with resource sanctions. Most humans complied, most. In the ruins of what had once been Detroit, a city that had built the mechanical backbone of an entire civilization before the stars ever became reachable, a man named Colonel James Harrow was digging. Not metaphorically, literally digging. With a salvage team of 6 engineers, 3 ex-military demolition specialists, and 1 very persistent historian named Dr. Carl Briggs, Harrow was excavating the sub-basement levels of a collapsed industrial complex that had once housed one of the largest precision manufacturing plants in North American history. Harrow was 44 years old, built like a man who had spent decades arguing with heavy machinery and winning, and he had a reputation among the human resistance cells for 2 things: an almost supernatural ability to read mechanical systems just by listening to them, and a complete, total, bone-deep refusal to accept that the universe had moved on. "She's down here," he said, brushing concrete dust from a rusted metal door. His breath fogged in the cold underground air. The salvage lights threw long shadows across collapsed ceiling beams and broken tile floors that still bore the faded outlines of machine footprints, massive presses, lathes, grinders, all long since stripped or destroyed. Dr. Carl Briggs crouched beside him, adjusting his glasses. Carl was the kind of man who looked like he belonged in a university archive, not a collapsed ruin under a dead city. But he knew more about 20th and 21st century industrial manufacturing than anyone alive, and that knowledge had made him the most valuable civilian asset the resistance had. The original facility records say the engineering vault was sealed during the first hegemony compliance sweep, Carl said. They cataloged the contents as non-compliant mechanical documentation and scheduled it for destruction. but the demolition team that swept this block. He tapped his worn datapad, filed an incomplete report. They never finished the job. Sloppy, Harrow said. Lucky, Carl corrected. The door took 20 minutes and a plasma cutter to open. What was inside took James Harrow's breath away in a way that nothing had in years. The vault was exactly as it had been left, sealed, pressurized, and perfectly preserved. Rows of physical blueprint cylinders lined the walls. Shelves of machined sample components sat in labeled cases, and in the center of the room, mounted on a stand like some kind of industrial altar, sat a display case containing a single chrome steel ball bearing, no bigger than a marble, polished to a mirror shine. The placard beneath it read, "The foundation of modern industry, simple, precise, unstoppable." Harrow picked it up, rolled it between his fingers, felt the weight of it, real, physical, undeniable weight, and something clicked in his mind like a tumbler in a lock. He turned to Carl. How many of these could we fabricate with the equipment we have at the Montana facility? Carl stared at him, then he looked at the bearing, then back at Harrow. James, he said slowly, what exactly are you thinking? Harrow set the bearing down on the vault's dusty floor. It rolled 3 inches and stopped, perfectly still, perfectly patient, as if it had been waiting decades for exactly this moment. I'm thinking, Harrow said, that the most powerful empire in the galaxy just forgot what happens when something stops sliding and starts grinding. Carl was quiet for a long moment. Then, very carefully, he pulled out his datapad and began taking notes. Neither man noticed the faint tremor that moved through the ground above them, the distant vibration of a hegemony patrol drone making its sweep of the city ruins. It passed without stopping. It detected nothing of interest. It had no idea what had just been found. The Montana facility did not look like the birthplace of a revolution. It looked like an old cattle processing plant, which is exactly what it had been before the hegemony compliance sweeps had shut down most of North America's independent industrial operations. The corrugated metal walls were streaked with rust. The loading docks sagged. 3 of the outbuildings had collapsed under winter snow loads and never been rebuilt. From any surveillance angle, it looked abandoned, useless, forgotten. Which was precisely why Colonel James Harrow had chosen it. Beneath the main floor, access through a cold storage shaft that required a magnetic key and a specific pattern of boot stomps to open, was a machining facility that Harrow's network had spent 4 years building in absolute secrecy. It was not large, but it was precise, and in the weeks following the Detroit Vault excavation, it became the most important workshop in human history. Harrow's core team had grown to 11. Besides Dr. Carl Briggs, there was Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a former aerospace propulsion engineer who had spent 15 years designing human ship engines before the hegemony had unified the colonial fleet under their own propulsion standards. There was Ryan Colton, a materials specialist who had once worked for a defense contractor and who could identify any metal alloy by sound, smell, and a light tap of his knuckle. There was Thomas Adler, a manufacturing systems expert who had grown up in a family of machinists and who approached every component they built with the quiet reverence of a craftsman who understood that precision was not a luxury. It was a survival skill. And then there was Nathan Cross, 26 years old, the youngest member of the team, former apprentice at the last independent machine shop in Wyoming before it was shut down. Nathan had grown up rebuilding old combustion engines with his father and grandfather, learning by feel and sound and instinct, and he had a gift for mechanical systems that the older engineers sometimes called unsettling. He could tell when a part was wrong before the instruments confirmed it. He could hear a stress fracture forming before it happened. It was Nathan who first ran the fabrication calculations for chrome steel ball bearings at scale. He stood at the central workbench on the 3rd day after the team had assembled, surrounded by digital scans of the blueprint cylinders from the Detroit Vault, and he laid out the numbers with the kind of calm clarity that made everyone in the room go very still. Standard hegemony frictionless drive systems use subquantum levitation fields generated by resonance cores, he said. Those cores are calibrated to maintain a specific electromagnetic environment around every moving part. No contact, no resistance, everything floats. He paused. The calibration is extremely sensitive. The tolerances on a hegemony drive core are tighter than anything they've ever had to defend because they've never had to defend against physical contact. Their entire mechanical doctrine assumes that nothing will ever touch. Marcus Webb leaned forward, and if something does touch, then the resonance field destabilizes, Nathan said. The levitation fails. The components, which are moving at extremely high speed because frictionless systems can spin far faster than anything with mechanical contact, make sudden, violent, uncontrolled physical contact with each other. He let that sit for a moment. At the rotational speeds their dreadnought drives operate, that's not a mechanical failure. That's a detonation. The room was very quiet. How many bearings would it take to bring down a dreadnought drive? Harrow asked. Nathan did not hesitate. Depends on delivery method. If you could introduce a sufficient quantity of microbearings directly into a drive housing, he pulled up a schematic, you'd need roughly 40 to 60,000 per drive core. A dreadnought has 8 primary cores. He looked up. But you wouldn't need to hit all 8. 3 cores simultaneously would cause a cascade failure. The field disruption from 3 would destabilize the other 5 automatically. Thomas Adler was already doing the math on his pad. We could fabricate to spec with the equipment we have. Chrome steel, 12 mm diameter for primary deployment, 3 mm for penetration-type delivery. The vault blueprints give us everything we need for the alloy composition. How long? Harrow asked. First production run enough for a meaningful field test, 3 weeks, Thomas said. Full deployment stock for a fleet action. He paused. 8 months, maybe 7 if we run double shifts. Harrow nodded slowly. He looked at the chrome bearing he had brought back from the Detroit vault, now sitting on the corner of the workbench. He had carried it in his jacket pocket every day since finding it. It had become a kind of talisman, a reminder of what the simplest things were capable of. Start production, he said, and nobody outside this room knows what we're making or why. As far as the resistance network is concerned, we are fabricating replacement components for agricultural machinery. What he did not say, what none of them needed to say, was that the hegemony had a surveillance network that monitored industrial energy signatures across all occupied territories. Running a precision machining facility at the level they needed, for the duration they needed, was going to generate a detectable heat signature eventually. They had a window. It was not a large window. 3 days into production, Ryan Colton came to Harrow with a quiet voice and a tight expression. "We've got a problem," he said. Harrow followed him to the corner of the machining floor, where Ryan pulled up a local sensor feed on a battered tablet. A hegemony administrative compliance officer, a Veltheran bureaucrat named Overseer Veth, had filed a routine inspection notice for the Montana Agricultural District. Standard sweep, scheduled 14 days out. 14 days, Harrow said. 14 days, Ryan confirmed. Harrow looked at the machining floor, where Thomas and Nathan were already running the first bearing production cycle, the soft mechanical hum of the lathe filling the underground space with a sound that felt, to Harrow, like the universe breathing correctly for the first time in years. He turned back to Ryan, "Then we work faster." But what none of them knew, what their sensors had not yet picked up, was that Overseer Veth's inspection notice was not routine. It had been triggered by an anonymous tip from inside the resistance network. Someone had talked. And Overseer Veth was already on his way. The trader's name was Dennis Holt. He was 40 years old, a mid-level logistics coordinator in the resistance network's North American supply chain, and he had never been a true believer. He had joined the network 3 years earlier because his brother was in it, and he had stayed because leaving felt more dangerous than remaining. When hegemony intelligence agents made quiet contact 6 months ago and offered him a resettlement package, full citizenship status, a housing allocation in the Veltheran colonial hub on Mars, guaranteed food and energy rations for life, Dennis Holt had made the calculation that most frightened men eventually make. He had chosen comfort over conviction. He did not know exactly what was being built in the Montana facility. He had passed along energy signature anomalies from his supply route data and a partial conversation he had overheard between 2 resistance couriers. It was enough. For the hegemony, it was more than enough. Overseer Veth arrived 48 hours ahead of his scheduled window. He came with 2 administrative shuttles and a 6-unit security complement. Tall, gray-uniformed Veltheran enforcers carrying disruption weapons that could scramble human neural function without leaving marks. They descended on the old cattle plant in the early morning hours, while frost still clung to the dead grass of the surrounding fields. Harrow's perimeter sensors gave them 4 minutes of warning. 4 minutes is not much time. It is, however, enough time for a man who has spent his entire adult life solving problems faster than they can kill him. "Destroy nothing," Harrow said, his voice absolutely level as his team scrambled. "We hide it, we move it, we buy time. We do not destroy our own work." What followed was the most precise controlled concealment. Operation a group of 11 engineers had ever executed under pressure. The machining equipment folded into false floor compartments that had been designed exactly for this scenario. The bearing stock, 2 weeks of production, thousands of small chrome spheres, went into sealed agricultural supply crates that were identical in external appearance to legitimate farm equipment parts. The Detroit vault blueprints were stored on a distributed encryption system that required 3 simultaneous key inputs to access, meaning no single person could be forced to give it up alone. By the time Overseer Veth's boots hit the concrete of the main floor, the facility looked like exactly what it claimed to be: a dusty, barely functional agricultural maintenance depot. Veth was not a soldier. He was a bureaucrat, which in some ways made him more dangerous. Bureaucrats were trained to notice inconsistencies, not to be distracted by drama. He moved through the facility slowly, his long silver fingers running along surfaces, his pale eyes recording everything. He stopped at the workbench where, 12 minutes earlier, Thomas Adler had been running a precision lathe. The surface was clean, almost too clean. Veth looked at Harrow, who stood with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who had nothing to hide. "Colonel Harrow," Veth said. His translator rendered his speech in flat, precise English. "You have filed agricultural maintenance certifications for this facility for 3 consecutive cycles, yet your energy consumption logs show output inconsistent with agricultural equipment servicing." "Old building," Harrow said. "Leaky insulation. We heat more than we need to keep the equipment from freezing." Veth tilted his head slightly. It was the Veltheran equivalent of a raised eyebrow. "Your heating signature is localized to the subfloor level." Silence. Then, very clearly, from somewhere beneath their feet, came a sound. It was small, almost nothing. The faintest rolling, the barest mechanical murmur of a chrome steel sphere completing a slow revolution inside a sealed crate that had not been fully latched. Veth heard it. Harrow saw that he heard it. And in that moment, every calculation Harrow had been running in his head, timing, exits, contingencies, the position of Veth's security detail, the distance to the access shaft, collapsed into a single, simple decision. He stepped forward and put himself directly between Veth and the crate. "You want to know what we're building down here," he said. "Then I'll show you. But first," his voice dropped, quiet and steady, "you should know that what's in that crate isn't a weapon. Not yet. Right now it's just a ball bearing, and I want you to think very carefully about what that means before you decide what to do next." Veth stared at him. The security detail shifted. Hands moved toward weapon holsters. Harrow did not move, did not flinch. He held Veth's gaze with the absolute stillness of a man who had already decided he was willing to die for the thing in that crate. Veth said nothing for a long, terrible moment. Then he reached for his communicator. And James Harrow moved. What Overseer Veth had not accounted for, what the hegemony's entire intelligence assessment of the human resistance had consistently failed to account for, was that James Harrow had not come to the Montana facility alone in any strategic sense. He had come with a plan that extended well beyond the walls of one building. The moment Harrow moved, three things happened simultaneously. First, Marcus Webb, stationed at the hidden communications terminal in the agricultural office on the far side of the building, transmitted a single encoded pulse to 7 resistance cells across North America. The pulse contained one word: grind. Second, the access shaft to the subfloor opened from the inside, and Nathan Cross emerged with a sealed canister roughly the size of a fire extinguisher, moving with the quiet urgency of a man who had rehearsed this exact moment many times. Third, Ryan Colton hit a circuit switch in the ceiling junction box that killed the building's primary lighting and replaced it with the red emergency strips, a change that, to human eyes, was minor. To Veltheran eyes, which were calibrated for the blue spectrum light of their home system, it was the rough equivalent of being suddenly plunged into near darkness. The security detail hesitated. That hesitation was enough. Harrow took Veth's communicator in a single controlled movement. No violence, no drama, just the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent years training for exactly this kind of moment. He held it and looked at the overseer with something that was almost, but not quite, respect. "You came looking for something dangerous," Harrow said. "You found it. Now, do you want to understand what it is, or do you want to make this harder than it needs to be?" Veth was, above all else, an intelligent being. And intelligent beings, when faced with a man who is clearly not bluffing and clearly not afraid, tend to pause. He paused. In that pause, Nathan set the canister on the workbench and unsealed the top. Inside, packed in tight foam inserts, were 40 of the first-generation grit bomb prototypes, small deployment canisters, each roughly 10 centimeters long, each containing approximately 60,000 microbearings of 3mm chrome steel, each fitted with a magnetic burst dispersal system that could scatter its contents through any opening larger than a thumbnail across a radius of 12 meters. Harrow picked one up and held it out to Veth. "This is what ended your empire," he said quietly. "Right here, this thing that fits in my hand." Veth looked at it. His expression was unreadable in the red light. But thousands of kilometers above the Montana flatlands, above the blue curve of Earth's atmosphere, in the cold silence of the orbital lanes, something was already happening that Veth had no way of knowing about. The *grind* signal had reached its targets. The Resistance Network's space assets were minimal, scattered, and mostly crewed by people flying ships that the hegemony considered too old and too primitive to bother monitoring closely. That had been a strategic miscalculation of historic proportions. For the past 18 months, Resistance engineers had been quietly retrofitting those primitive ships with bearing drive propulsion systems, human-built engines that used controlled friction to generate massive thermal energy, built on the same principles as the ball-bearing program, running hot and loud and powerful in ways that hegemony frictionless drives simply could not match in certain critical conditions. Specifically, close-quarters debris field combat. Hegemony dreadnoughts were magnificent in open space. Their frictionless hulls, their levitation-cushioned systems, their silence-optimized construction, all of it was designed for the clean, unobstructed vacuum of deep space engagement. Put them in a debris field, floating rock, shattered hull fragments, the grinding particulate chaos of an asteroid belt, and their perfectly calibrated systems became a liability. Every contact triggered micro-disruptions. Every particle impact was an event their systems had to compensate for. Human ships, built on mechanical principles that assumed contact, assumed resistance, assumed that the world was going to push back, they were at home in chaos. Commander Robert Hale understood this better than anyone. Hale was 51 years old, former commander of Earth's colonial defense fleet before the hegemony absorption, and he had spent the 7 years since losing his command learning everything there was to learn about how to fight a superior force with an inferior hand. He was not a man who trusted luck. He trusted preparation. He trusted physics. And he trusted the bearing drive engines now running hot in the hulls of his 14-ship strike formation, positioned at the edge of the Kepler debris field, a dense, churning belt of shattered rock and metal 200,000 kilometers above Earth's orbital plane. When the grind asterisk signal reached him, Hale was standing at the navigation station of his flagship, the Tyler Mace asterisk, watching the 8-ship Hegemony Patrol Group holding station at the debris field's outer edge. "All ships bearing drive to full," he said. "Let them hear us coming." And they did hear it. That was the point. The Tyler Mace and her 13 sisters lit up the silence of space with the sound of real engines, mechanical, thermal, loud in the electromagnetic sense, broadcasting a signature that every hegemony sensor in range would lock onto instantly. The Hegemony Patrol Commander, a Veltharan named Fleet Warden Keth, received the contact report and immediately began calculating an intercept. His ships were faster in open space. His weapons were superior at range. He had every tactical advantage a commander could want. He moved his patrol group forward, away from the debris field edge, into open space, to meet the approaching human formation at maximum engagement distance. He moved away from the debris, exactly as Robert Hale had planned. Because the 14 human ships did not slow down, they did not engage at range. They went straight into the debris field at full bearing drive power, and they disappeared into the chaos of rock and shattered metal like they had been born there. Because their hulls were built to take contact, their systems were designed to absorb impact, and their engines ran hotter and harder the more resistance they encountered. And when Hale's formation came out the other side of the debris field, they came out directly behind Keth's patrol group, which had overextended chasing a formation that had simply gone through the one place Keth could not follow. "Grit bomb deployment," Hale said. "All ships." The canisters went out in coordinated salvos, targeted with precise mechanical delivery systems at the exhaust ports and drive housings of the Hegemony patrol ships. 60,000 micro-bearings per canister, 8 canisters per target ship. The chrome steel spheres found every gap, every vent, every intake, and poured into the beating mechanical hearts of hegemony technology that had never, in its entire operational lifespan, been asked to deal with something as ancient and simple and absolutely devastating as physical contact. The first hegemony ship went dark 30 seconds after impact. The second went 8 seconds later. By the time Fleet Warden Keth understood what was happening to his drive cores, 3 of his 8 ships were already tumbling, their resonance fields collapsed, their levitation systems destroyed, their engines seizing with the catastrophic violence of machinery operating at extreme speed, making sudden unplanned contact with itself. In the red-lit underground of the Montana facility, James Harrow's communicator, recovered from Veth's hand, began to receive the first fragmented signal reports from orbit. He read them in silence, then he looked at Overseer Veth. "The first battle," he said, "just ended." He did not say who had won. He did not need to. Veth had gone very still. His silver-gray skin had taken on a quality that Harrow had never seen in a Veltheran before. It took him a moment to identify it. It was fear. The hegemony's response was not slow. It could not afford to be. Losing 8 patrol ships in a single engagement, 8 ships of the line, to a force that by every metric should not have been able to threaten them, was not a military setback. It was a message. And the Veltheran High Council, gathered in emergency session aboard the command station Serene Dominion in Earth orbit, understood exactly what kind of message it was. The kind that spread. "Contain it," Supreme Warden Velsareth said. He was the senior military commander of the Earth occupation, tall even by Veltheran standards, his uniform bearing the silver thread marks of 40 years of undefeated campaigns. He stood at the head of a long table and looked at the faces of his officers with the expression of a man who was not frightened and was not going to allow anyone else in the room to be frightened either. Contain the information, contain the tactical data, and respond with overwhelming force before this propagates to the outer colonies. His intelligence director spoke carefully. The problem, Supreme Warden, is that the tactical data is already propagating. Our patrol ship's final transmissions were received by 2 hegemony civilian shipping lanes. We cannot. Then we deal with that. Velsareth turned to his fleet commander. I want a full dreadnought response, not a show of force, a demonstration of finality. I want whatever human force is operating in the Earth orbital zone located, engaged, and eliminated within 48 hours. What Velsareth did not know, because his intelligence apparatus had spent 30 years building a picture of human capability that was catastrophically out of date, was that Robert Hale's 14-ship strike formation was not the full extent of what the Resistance had prepared. It was the opening move. While Hale's ships returned to dispersal positions in the outer debris fields, 31 additional Resistance vessels were moving into position across the inner system, each one crewed by engineers who had spent months learning the bearing drive system from the inside out, understanding not just how to operate it, but how to push it, how to run the friction thermal cycle into ranges that the original designers had considered theoretical maximums. Nathan Cross had been the one to discover that those maximums were not actually maximums. They were starting points. He had run the calculations 6 weeks earlier, in the quiet of the Montana machining floor, while the rest of the team slept. Bearing drive thermal output at standard operating parameters was already impressive, enough to power weapons systems that hit harder than anything the Resistance had previously fielded. But if you increase the chrome-steel bearing diameter in the primary friction cycle and simultaneously compress the thermal transfer chamber, the output did not increase linearly. It increased exponentially. The math worked, the materials held, and the result was a weapons-grade thermal lance that could punch through the outer hull of a hegemony dreadnought, a hull designed to absorb energy weapons, not kinetic thermal impact, in under 4 seconds of sustained contact. They had called it, with the simple directness of engineers who did not have time for poetry, the grinder. Commander Hale had 3 ships equipped with grinder weapons. He had been waiting for the moment to use them. That moment arrived when Velsareth's dreadnought response, 2 ships of the line, the Asterisk Frictionless Ascent and the Mandate's Voice Asterisk, each the size of a small city, each carrying enough firepower to glass a continent, entered the inner system and began their search sweep. Hale watched them on his navigation display and felt the familiar cold calculation of a man who had made a career out of winning fights he was not supposed to win. The dreadnoughts were massive, powerful, and utterly confident. They had every reason to be. In any conventional engagement, they were untouchable. They were also designed to operate in clean, open space. "Take us back in," Hale said, and the Tyler Mace turned back toward the debris field. What followed lasted 11 hours. It was not a battle in any traditional sense, not the kind of engagement that happens in clean lines with ships facing each other at measured distance. It was a grinding, relentless pursuit through the chaos of the debris field, with Hale's formation using the intimate knowledge they had built of the field's topology to pull the dreadnoughts in deeper and deeper, always staying just far enough ahead to be chased, always moving through vectors that the hegemony navigators, operating frictionless systems that flinched from every particle contact, could follow only with increasing difficulty and damage. And while the dreadnoughts chased, the three grinder-equipped ships were moving on a separate approach vector, coming in from below the debris field's plane, silent and cold. At hour 11, Hale gave the signal. The manifest asterisk, the asterisk ridge runner asterisk, and the copperhead came up under the asterisk frictionless ascent simultaneously, and their grinder weapons, running at the extended thermal output Nathan Cross had calculated, burned through her lower hull plating in the time it takes to say it. The asterisk frictionless ascent did not explode. She vented catastrophically, her frictionless drive cores destabilized by the hull breach, her levitation fields collapsing in cascade sequence through her lower decks. She went dark and tumbling, a trillion-credit monument to a military doctrine that had never planned for an enemy who understood something the hegemony had spent 7 years trying to eliminate from the universe. That friction was not a flaw. It was a force. On the asterisk mandate's voice asterisk, Fleet Admiral Curell received the distress signal from the ascent, and for the first time in 40 years of hegemony service, he did not know what to do next. His tactical system had no response protocol for an engagement fought on these terms. His crew looked to him with the particular helpless expression of people whose entire understanding of how the universe worked had just been physically dismantled in front of them. He ordered a retreat. It was the first time in the history of the galactic hegemony that a dreadnought-class warship had retreated from a human engagement. It would not be the last. In the Montana facility, Harrow received the battle report from orbit and read it standing at the workbench, with the original chrome ball bearing from the Detroit vault in his hand. Veth was secured in the corner, no longer trying to contact his command. He had gone very quiet. His pale eyes tracked Harrow with an expression that had moved beyond fear into something that looked almost like comprehension. "You planned all of this," Veth said, "not an accusation, an observation." Harrow set the bearing down on the workbench. "We planned the beginning," he said. "The rest is just physics." He looked at the bearing for a moment, then he looked up at Veth. "Tell me something," he said. "When the Council passed the mandate of smooth continuance, when they decided that friction was an inefficiency to be eliminated, did any of them ever stop to think about what friction actually does?" Veth said nothing. "It creates heat," Harrow said. "It creates resistance. It creates wear." He paused. "It also creates traction. Without it, nothing grips, nothing holds, nothing moves under its own power. You took friction out of the universe because it was inconvenient, and you never stopped to ask what you were taking out with it." He picked up the bearing one more time. "You took out the will to push back. The hegemony did not fall in a day. Empires never do. They are too large, too complex, too deeply embedded in the systems they have built to simply collapse because they lost 2 ships and a patrol group in one solar system. The Veltheran High Council met for 37 consecutive hours following the engagement at the Kepler debris field. There were voices in that session calling for total orbital bombardment of Earth. Voices that argued the human resistance had to be made an example of, that anything less than absolute force would signal weakness across the outer colonies and trigger a cascade of rebellions. Those voices did not prevail. Hay did not prevail because the intelligence director, the same one who had warned Velsareth that the tactical data was already spreading, had a more complete picture of what was actually happening, and the picture was this. The ball bearing program was not contained to Earth. In the weeks since the Montana facility had gone fully operational, bearing production had been quietly transferred to 14 other resistance cells across North America and 2 additional cells in the European Administrative Zone. Grit bomb stock was already distributed and cached across the resistance network. The bearing drive propulsion design had been transmitted in encrypted format to colonial resistance groups in 3 outer system settlements. The weapon was not a weapon anymore. It was an idea. And ideas, the intelligence director told the High Council with the quiet precision of someone who had spent a career studying the one species that kept surprising them, could not be bombarded into submission. Humans, she said, have a word for what they have just demonstrated. They call it leverage. The hegemony's decision, reached in the 37th hour of that emergency session, was not surrender. It was negotiation, which, for a government that had not negotiated with humanity in 31 years, was its own form of capitulation. A formal communication was transmitted to the North American Resistance Command, which, for the first time in 3 decades, was acknowledged in the header as a legitimate governing entity, requesting terms for a ceasefire and the opening of technology arbitration proceedings. Harrow read the communication in the Montana facility, sitting at the same workbench where the first bearings had been fabricated. Carl Briggs was beside him. Marcus Webb stood at the door. Nathan Cross was still at the machining floor, already working on third-generation grinder specifications, not because anyone had asked him to, but because that was simply who Nathan Cross was. Harrow read the communication 3 times. Then he set it down and looked at the original ball bearing from the Detroit vault, which now sat in a small cleared space on the workbench, not in a case, not mounted on anything, just sitting there. Simple, precise, unstoppable. They want to negotiate, Carl said. They want time, Harrow corrected. There's a difference. He was quiet for a moment. We give them terms, real terms, full political autonomy for all human colonial settlements, immediate withdrawal from Earth's administrative zone, and he picked up the bearing, formal galactic recognition that mechanical technology is not primitive, it's foundational. They won't accept all of that immediately, Carl said. No, Harrow agreed, but they'll accept enough of it, because the alternative is us spending the next 2 years teaching every resistance cell in the galaxy how to fabricate chrome steel. He looked at Carl, and they know that. That's why they called. The negotiations took 4 months. They were difficult, contested, and at several points nearly collapsed entirely. But the final agreement, ratified by the Hegemony Council and the newly formed Human Sovereignty Assembly, established what became known formally as the Accords of Mechanical Standing. Under the Accords, human and allied colonial territories regained full political self-governance. Hegemony military forces withdrew from Earth orbit within 60 days. And in what became the most symbolically significant provision of the entire agreement, the mandate of smooth continuance was repealed. Kinetic friction was legal again in galactic space. The reaction to that provision spread faster than any military victory could have. In the outer colonies, where dozens of species had lived under the mandate's restrictions and watched the human resistance with a mixture of disbelief and slowly growing hope, the repeal was received as something more than a policy change. It was permission. Permission to remember that resistance was not inefficiency. That contact was not primitive. That the push and pull of real engagement with the physical world, the grind of it, the noise of it, the heat and wear and unavoidable consequence of it, was not something to be engineered away. It was how things got built. 6 months after the Accords were signed, Commander Robert Hale stood in what had once been the main administrative hall of the Hegemony Oversight Compound in what had once been called Detroit, now reclaimed, and in the early stages of becoming something new again. Around him, reconstruction crews moved through the space with the organized energy of people who had something to build and knew how to build it. The sound of real machinery filled the air, not the silence of levitation, but the purposeful noise of tools doing work, of material being shaped, of human hands applying force and getting force back. A journalist from the New Free Press asked him what he thought the legacy of the ball-bearing campaign would be. Hale thought about it for a moment. He was not a man who gave careless answers. "People are going to want to make it about the technology," he said finally. "They'll want to say we won because we found the right weapon, but that's not what happened." He looked out at the reconstruction crews. "We won because we remembered something the hegemony had forgotten, that you can't build anything real in a world without resistance. You can't make anything that lasts without something to push against." He paused. Friction isn't a flaw in the universe. It's the universe telling you it's real. In the Montana facility, cleared now, the false floors open, the machining equipment running in full light for the first time, Nathan Cross was finishing a production run. Not grit bombs, not grinder weapons. These were standard chrome steel ball bearings, production grade to spec, ready for shipment to the 17 outer colony resistance groups that had, in the wake of the Accords, begun building their own independent mechanical infrastructure. He picked up the last bearing off the finishing rack, held it between two fingers, felt its weight, the specific, undeniable physical weight of something real in a universe that had briefly tried to make everything weightless. He set it in its shipping case, sealed the lid. From somewhere in the building, the sound of a lathe running at full power rose and filled the air, warm, mechanical, loud, and completely alive. James Harrow would later say that the moment the galaxy started getting loud again was the moment he knew it was going to be all right. And above the blue curve of the Earth, in the orbital lanes that had once been patrolled by frictionless hegemony ships moving in absolute silence, the first independent human freighters were running their new bearing drive engines at full thermal output, loud, vibrating, burning hot, crossing the sky like moving stars, carrying the weight of a future that had been built, piece by piece, from the simplest geometric shape in human history. A sphere perfectly round, perfectly patient, and utterly unstoppable. That was HFY Endurance Tales, and if this story hit different for you, then you already know what to do. Smash that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear that resistance isn't weakness, it's the whole point. Drop a comment below. Which moment hit hardest for you, the Detroit Vault, the first battle, or the final line? Every comment matters a lot.